Before we get started on music-mixed forests, I want to acknowledge that Hawaii is an aboriginal space where descendants of the original people are Kanaka-Oiwi, or Native Hawaiian. Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani was coerced into relenting the Hawaiian kingdom and surrounding territories under duress in order to avoid further bloodshed of her people by the United States. It's important to remember that Aboriginal Hawaiians and their traditional ecological knowledge systems have shaped Hawaii in a sustainable way for millennia prior to European and American colonization of the area. Next, we'll dive into what classifies a forest as a music-mixed forest. The tropical moist forest ecoregion in Hawaii encompasses music-mixed forests, tropical rainforests, bogs, swampy areas, and wet shrublands. Mixed music forests are located between 750 to 1,250 meters, which is about 2,500 to 4,000 feet in elevation. The word music basically refers to habitats that have a well-balanced supply of moisture, and music-mixed forests receive anywhere from 1,000 to 3,800 millimeters of rainfall annually. These forests are typically located in windward lowland and montane areas on the larger islands and on the mountaintops of smaller islands. It's also interesting to note that rainforests are actually located higher in elevation compared to music-mixed forests. This map shows the current extent of music-mixed forests in Hawaii, which make up about 12% of the state, but it's only estimated to be about 40% of the pre-human biome that existed. This next map shows estimations of the coverage of different biomes in Hawaii before human contact, and the music-mixed forests are shown in the lighter green shading on the islands. Music forests are neither considered wet nor dry due to the moderate amount of rainfall that they receive, and their climatic conditions are largely controlled by trade winds. Trade winds and their relationships with ocean circulation patterns lead to warm air hitting the coasts that then rises, cools, and rains down on tropical rainforests. Music areas surrounding the tropical rainforests receive a more moderate amount of rainfall. There are 4 different subcategories of music-mixed forests in Hawaii. The 2 in the left column are the native forests, which are lowland and montane, and that's basically the location of the forest. Lowland is more a coastal, and then montane music being higher elevation. The next 2 subcategories are introduced music plantations and introduced wet music forests. So these are non-native to Hawaii, and introduced music plantations are things like fruit and nut orchards or timber harvesting and managing for different types of pine trees, all of these not being native species to Hawaii. Introduced wet music forests are mainly comprised of introduced species from Oceania and Asia, such as bamboo, ironwood, guava, and many other introduced species. Both lowland and montane music-mixed forests are extremely important in terms of biodiversity and endemism, as more than 15,000 species are endemic just to the islands, including more than 1,200 vascular plants. However, with having so many vascular plants and trees, it isn't possible to do dendrochronology since there aren't really tree rings and you can't cross-date them to any other tree rings. Next, this chart to the right shows the breakup of different types of music forest systems in Hawaii, and as you can see in the yellow, a lot of it is now non-native music forest, with the other categories representing the forests based on their most prevalent tree, which is either ohia or koa. But it's interesting to look at how little native forest land there is left compared to all of this non-native land. Now I'd like to introduce you to some of the species of importance in the music-mixed forests of Hawaii. These music forests are considered mixed because not just one tree dominates the forest, and it can't be classified just by one dominant tree type because there's a pretty even distribution of several, and 2 of the most important canopy trees are acacia koa and ohia lehua. These are the 2 most prevalent canopy tree species in these forests, although there are a couple other trees that are prominent as well. In native music-mixed forests, the understory can be comprised of a lot of different species. There are thousands of plant species that live in these forests, but it can be dominated by ferns and tree-like ferns, such as species in Sedlaria and Dryopteris. The photos on the slide here are ones that I took in 2016, at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Next, I'd like to introduce the only extant mammal that is endemic to the Hawaiian Islands, which is the Hawaiian hoary bat. Hawaiian hoary bats are solitary roosters, meaning that they don't roost in a colony together. This makes it hard to detect them and can make population estimates difficult. Nevertheless, they are considered endangered, especially with threats of climate change that can drastically change their habitat and availability of food. The next group of species that I'd like to highlight are Hawaiian honeycreepers. Similar to Darwin's finches, a lot of endemism happened and speciation events occurred as these birds tried to fill niches in their environment. So there are several different types of honeycreepers, each with different adaptations to their beaks, calls, and ways that they feed in order for them to best get what they need out of the forest. Another group of species that is important to this area are in Drosophila, and these are flies that also have high rates of speciation, and they're very important in studies of evolutionary ecology because of their short generation time. So they're studied a lot in looking at speciation events and how that occurs. Moving on to disturbance regimes. Historically, before human contact, a lot of the disturbance regimes in terms of fire were typically started by lava flows or lightning. And lightning events most often occur in the wet season, meaning that few ignitions historically occurred. These historic stochastic events did not impact mesic-mixed forests a lot because they were resilient at the time before human contact. The earliest humans thought to have reached the Hawaiian Islands are Polynesians who may have arrived as early as 400 CE. These people settled the lands and used widespread use of fire for agriculture and land clearing. This reshaped a lot of the ecosystems, and grasslands that did not appear on the islands before are now very vast. The first European did not arrive in the Hawaiian Islands until 1778. This quote on the right really encapsulates the way that Native Hawaiians look to sustain and manage land. The life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. In the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, Americans began to colonize the Hawaiian Islands, which included a lot of disturbance and human development in the area, not to mention the forcible removal of the Native Hawaiians who lived there. There has been a dramatic increase in more intense and severe fires across the islands since colonization, and this is in part due to invasive grasses that have crept into the understories of these forests, but also due to human-caused fires, which were not historically part of the regime. The mesic-mixed forests in Hawaii are critically endangered for a number of reasons. One of the greatest threats to the mesic-mixed forests are invasive species. Invasive feral ungulates such as wild boars can tear up the ground, destroy trees and other plants, and can even damage water tables. Invasive rodents such as mongoose and rats also take a large part in decimating native pollinator and insect populations as well as bird populations, and they also damage plants such as the flower pictured here. Finally, invasive grasses and weeds, which have taken over many grasslands and up into the understories of forests, pose a giant hazard for fires. They also push out native plant species, leading to a monoculture. Another critical threat to these forests is human development and land conversion. Much of Hawaii's native ecosystems have already been decimated by land clearing for agriculture, military, and urbanization. Logging and timber are still issues faced by mesic-mixed forests in Hawaii, as well as horticulture and recreation and tourism. Recreation and tourism can do a lot of damage to these ecosystems. Potentially most notably is the effects that climate change may have on the mesic-mixed forests of Hawaii. As temperatures rise, species will start to move upward to higher elevations in order to reach the conditions that they need. However, islands are very limited in space, and there's really nowhere else to go once you reach the top of the mountains. This slide shows a number of endangered species in Hawaii, and the map shows the remaining native land left on the islands. Since Hawaii was not declared as a state until 1959, there isn't as much natural resource policy that went into the islands before that. However, they did begin with soil and water conservation districts, where they split up the islands into different soil and water conservation districts based on the needs of those areas. Past management strategies were very focused on stopping erosion in order to protect farmland and water. So it was very much watershed protection, flood protection, and more about farming and soil and sediment control rather than looking at the ecosystem as a whole. Looking at today's conservation strategies, there's a lot more planning that's gone into it, and an ecoregional plan was created by the Nature Conservancy in 1998 to recognize threats to the area. It created multi-region strategies for things like watershed partnerships, more state funding, more management capacity, and the prevention of alien species. Today, there's also a larger focus on native plant and forest restoration efforts. Today, we have more comprehensive conservation area strategies, which include acquiring more lands and waters, managing conservation areas, building up the staffing capacity, engaging with partners and stakeholders, building conservation support, and measuring conservation progress. The Hawaii Forest Action Plan in 2016 analyzed the current conditions, threats, and trends of the forest, and determined the gaps and opportunities with the data provided. This chart on the right shows who owns the mesic-mixed forest in Hawaii, and it's largely owned by private landowners. So it's super important going forward to be connecting with those landowners and finding ways to incentivize them to protect those forests and the watersheds within them. For future management actions, it's going to be crucial to focus on watershed protection. Focusing on areas with the most potential for groundwater recharge will be important in saving the remaining watersheds that is possible. It's also important to, again, make more easements and incentives for private landowners or purchasing remaining areas with mesic-mixed forests if possible. We also need to make sure to use fire to combat fuel buildup, especially from these invasive grasses that get into the mixed mesic forests. Continuing the efforts that were laid out in the Hawaii Forest Action Plan in 2016 so we can better understand the trends in the forest and the threats that it faces. Here are my references for this presentation. I hope you learned a lot about mesic-mixed forests of Hawaii, and thank you so much for listening.